So I'm going to press T to bring up my tool shelf and select my full screen button in my zero brush menu, press Shift A and add a plane, hit S to scale, and I'm going to go ahead and under display turn off my grid floor and the grid lines since we won't really need them. Now that I've got this plane here, I'm just going to press my texture paint button, and this will give us a default 2048 by 2048 layer to start painting on. So I'll click brush so we can load a brush. And if you don't have this pack already, this is the Seamless Elemental Brush Pack we can get at blendersensei.com, or you can pick up the sample pack for this tutorial also. So I'm just going to select this grass short texture here, and I'm going to turn off the strength and increase the hardness because it makes it a lot easier to quickly put down a layer onto our object. So actually the next series of brushes I'll be loading, I will want to do this same thing. So rather than having to adjust those settings every time, under my load brush settings, I'm just going to select load as hard, and it will load my brushes as hard brushes each time. So I'm going to press 5 to go into top view, and I could just sit here and paint this layer out, but one quick way to lay down a base layer is to select our circle stroke tool, select in the middle somewhere, and then just drag. And then as soon as it fills the object, just let go. On an object this big, once it's filling up the whole thing, Blender will stutter just a little bit, just give it a second, and then let go, and you've got this kind of basic brush layer here, which is nice. Let's click on our object mode button to get out of texture paint mode, and that will of course also save our layer we just created. And then let's select this default cube here and tap W 3 or 4 times, well maybe 5, and S to scale, and G to grab to pick it up just a little bit. And what we're going to do is make a boulder out of this default cube here. So I'm going to select the sculpt button and press make sculptable to make this sculptable. And if we start trying to sculpt on it right now, there's not really a lot of geometry or detail, if you will, to work with. So I'll press my reset button to reset those strokes I just did, and let's click more until we get about maybe 8 or 9 levels. Probably 8 will be okay. I'll tap space, which brings up my brush selection menu in zero brush, and let's select clay strips, and I'll increase the size of my brush and maybe also increase the strength a bit. And I just want to make this default cube here not look so symmetrical. As I'm sculpting, I'm also holding shift to sculpt into this as well. So we don't want to get too detailed with this, because what we're actually going to do is make our base mesh from this default cube. So what I mean by that is we're currently in sculpt mode, as you can see down here. And so this is what the object looks like with the multi-res modifier on it. But if I press tab, this is what the actual soul, if you will, the core of this object is. It's just this simple cube. And when you make things from a very simple object, and then you want to do things like start painting on it or use normal maps or any kind of advanced stuff, typically your object will need a little more geometry than if you're just using something so simple. So what we're actually going to do, I'll hit tab to go back into sculpt mode. We're creating something with a little more geometry to be our kind of base object. Kind of think of it as the skeleton or the soul of the object, if you will. And I'm going to press space and then select my grab brush here, and then press X to increase the size of the brush. One tip when you're using a brush, whether you're sculpting or painting, if you've pressed X and you're moving your mouse all the way and you've maxed out the radius of the brush and you can't get any bigger but you want it to select more area, you can always just zoom out some and of course do it that way. So this is enough detail for our kind of base mesh we're going to make. If I press Z, which puts me into wireframe mode, this lets us see how many faces are actually composing this object, which is a pretty good amount. So we've got, almost 400,000 faces. Only one of them is the ground. The rest are this boulder here. So when we press tab to go into edit mode, that shows what the core of the object looks like. but when we press Z to go into wireframe, we get to see exactly what we're looking at, the way it's being manipulated. So what we want to do is actually create our base object to work with from here on out that is somewhere in the middle ground. So it's not made up of such a simple tiny amount of faces, but there's not so many faces that it gets too convoluted to work with. So we've got our kind of base shape here. Let's just press less, which decreases the amount of subdivisions. And if I press Z so we can look at this in wireframe, you'll see what it's doing there. Increasing the amount of detail to a high level and then sculpting and then pressing less is a great way to create a base object. So we'll press less, and you see if I go all the way down, we're back to the cube. But if I press more, it starts going back into the detail. So we just want something a little more complex, such as this, to be our base core object, and this will be really the right amount of geometry to make good looking normal maps and when we paint on it and everything else. So we won't click as image, that would apply a normal map. We'll just press apply, and if we press Z, this has now become our core object. So when I hit tab this time, it doesn't go back to a cube anymore. This is the base object here. And this is a much better level of geometry to be working with. I'll hit tab to go out of edit mode and back into sculpt mode, and we'll press make sculptable again and press more, and we'll do that up until maybe 7 subdivision levels. Or 6 would probably also be good. I'm starting to stall out a little here. We'll just do it at 6. And of course, if things start getting too slow, you can just press Q and click Use Fast Mode, which helps speed up the display. But it also disables textures while you're sculpting, so I don't feel like doing that. So I'm going to use clay strips again, and And of course, if your mesh starts getting too folded or messed up, you can always hold Control and then smooth that out, or just press space and select your smooth brush. Okay, so this is a good enough simple little rock here. So now we will go ahead and press as image, which will apply this detail as a normal map. So that's done. If I were to press Z right now to go into wireframe mode, we're still at our really high subdivision level, but now we can press less, and I'll press Z so we can see how that's decreasing the amount of geometry here. And then I press Z again. So we see we're now using a much smaller amount of geometry, but we still have that detail saved from our normal map. And then of course we can click on our texture paint button and directly change this normal map. And this normal map works for cycles as well as Blender render. So I'll click on my sculpt button to go back to it. Let's actually click on the texture paint button and load up a rock texture. I'll just use this rock face here. Yeah, whenever you've made a normal map, always remember to click off that normal map and onto a color layer or add another layer, else you'll destroy your normal map. So Control Z, click on my color layer because I don't want to paint on my normal map, and there we go. Then I'll also click my paint through button, which allows me to paint all the way through this. And then I'll turn the paint through off and decrease the hardness so I can clean up these areas where that base layer didn't look really great. Of course, we can change the scale of our texture here, and what that allows us to change how big or little the image goes on without actually changing the size of our brush. So the great thing about having a normal map is once we have that normal map on there, we can also adjust the bump of any color map that we use and get double the amount of detail. So we just turn that bump up just a little bit, and so now we have an object using not a whole lot of resources and producing some pretty awesome looking results here. So the rock's a bit shiny, probably a little more than we want it to be, So let's bring our layer size down to 64, because if you're going to make a solid color layer and you don't plan on painting on it, it can be really small and still do the same job. And I'm going to press Options and Color New Layers, and then I'm going to just add a specular. And this allows us a quick, lazy way to just adjust the amount of specularity on our object. So I'll decrease that quite a little bit. And so that's maybe even too bright. So what we could do is bring down the color here, and we can see that's what our color actually looks like there in that little sliver. And then press X to delete that specular layer, and then add another one. And now we've got a much less bright specular layer that does a much better job. So I'll click on my cube color, and now I can afford to actually increase the bump a little bit more now that the specular layer isn't quite so verbose. And so we've got our awesome normal map and our bump mapping on this rock, so that's pretty cool. Okay, so we're at a point with this that we should probably go ahead and save this. So let's click on File and Save As, and then you would want to save it wherever you keep stuff. I'm just going to save this to the desktop for now, and I'll just call it Simple Scene, I guess, and click Save as Blender File. So now let's click on our Object Mode button and select back on our little grass plane and select our Texture Paint button, and then under Brush, let's load some dirt. So I'm just gonna load one of these. Doesn't really matter what kind of dirt you're using, but so rather than just painting this straight onto this grass, what I'm gonna do is create another color layer. And that's right, I forgot that we left layer size on 64 and we told it to color new layers, so we don't want it to do that anymore. We'll turn color new layers off and change this back to 2048, and then we'll press X to delete that layer and press add color. And so now I can start painting this dirt underneath this rock. My edges are still super hard, so I'll bring my hardness down and then just paint around these edges so that it will be smooth. The edges of this dirt look decent, but there's something we could do to make them look even cooler, to create kind of a middle ground between the dirt slash mud and the grass. And so what we'll do is we'll add another color layer. This time we'll press 5 to go into top view, and I'm going to paint some dirt slash mud around this perimeter here. But now I'm going to change this mode from mix to lighten, and you'll see what that does is create kind of a mixture between these two colors. You always want to just experiment with the way these are going to look, because they're going to look differently for different types of layers. But as you can see, we can paint on here and get these kind of splotchy areas that aren't so obvious. And then of course we can hold shift if we want to erase that area as well. So I think what I'll do is click on this direct mud one when we have the regular mix, and I'll hold shift, and I think I'll delete some area around this, our rock here, and then I'll select our layer that we're using, lighten, and I'll erase some areas around here, and then I'll just paint that on around our border, the main mud area. We can also press Shift X and decrease the strength of this so we get even lighter mixing between the grass and the mud. So we could have a very well dithered difference between this mud up to our stone. So I'll select my Object Mode button, and what I would like to do now is cut the difference between the mud and the rock. So I would like a little bit of mud on this rock here, so I'll click the Texture Paint button. So this time, instead of making another layer, and I'll click back on my color, because that's the bit we want to paint on. So instead of making a whole nother layer for this, what I'm just going to do is directly paint onto it. Now, an important thing about these mix modes are that these mix modes change the way that these layers affect one another. But when you're using a different mix mode on your brush, that will only have an effect if there's already something painted on it. So for instance, if I were to click Add Color and create a new layer, so you see I'm painting right now with this mud, but if I were to change this mix mode, like to lighten or something, it does nothing because the mix mode of the brush is only considering what's on that layer, and it doesn't think about any of these other layers, whereas changing the mode here considers all the layers. So I can change the brush to anything, and it's only going to have a result on what's already painted on there. So just keep that in mind, that changing the mode here is pretty much only for stuff you're painting on that individual layer, and then getting these layers to play with one another, you do the mixing here. But I'll delete this layer because I am going to just paint directly onto this color layer here, and then we'll change this to color burn. And I'll press Shift X to decrease the amount of strength on my brush, or maybe just increase a little bit more. And then I'm just going to go around the edges of this rock to kind of make it look like dust and dirt from the ground got on there. And then I could decrease my strength a little and then maybe just splotch the rock itself a little bit with little areas of dirt. I might want to turn down the hardness of my brush so the blends in very smoothly, and then so I've just got a little bit more detail on the rock itself. So let's go ahead and press File and Save, because I want to bake an ambient layer onto this rock, but we always want to make sure we save before we do a bake, because sometimes Blender gets a bit finicky. So I'll press the Object Mode button. Actually, since pressing the Object Mode button just saved the changes we painted on that layer, then you would want to go ahead and save it. File, Save. And then let's Shift Select our ground. And so let's add an ambient layer to these two objects. So I'll press Q to bring up my zero brush options. And since this is just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to lower the bake quality down to 5. And then I'm going to set this to 512, which this will make a 512 by 512 ambient map for each object selected. Now, whenever you bake a material or an ambient or a shadow, if each of these objects have their own UV map, which they do, anything you go to paint on will have its own UV map, then these maps will bake for the individual objects, which is most of the time what you want, because you don't want all your assets getting all mixed up. So let's press Q, and we'll press Bake Ambient, and this will bake an individual 512 by 512 map for each one of these objects. And so that's done, and that looks pretty cool. So the immediate ambient coming off on the ground here looks cool, and also on the rock. Looks a bit dark on the rock, so we'll select the rock, click our texture paint button, and we're selected on our ambient layer. So you can see it says AO for ambient occlusion. We can increase or decrease this darkness, and actually I think most of the darkness from the bottom is coming from that extra bit of dirt, so we may consider doing something about that. And the default mode is multiply, but you could set that to overlay, and you can see that kind of does some cool stuff actually to the normal map, the way that looks. Change it to value, that's no good. Lighten, ugh. Let's just leave that on multiply. And of course, if you wanted to bake this in cycles, you could have just pressed Q, click Use Cycles, and then do the same thing. Select them both, press Bake Ambient. And you'll notice that when you bake them in cycles, it'll look like everything got washed over, because as we talked about, only one color layer in ZeroBrush can display in cycles at a time, unless we, of course, make a merged layer, which we talked about. But then when you go back to, you click off of cycles and go back to Blender Render, you'll have your cycles baked ambient maps all set up and working and set to multiply, so you can see through them and everything looking cool. Finally, if you were doing this for a game asset, you would want to make sure that your geometry isn't too wild. You don't have like a lot of mesh. So if we press Z right now, well, rather if we go into object mode and then press Z, we can see that this rock is pretty modest. It doesn't use a lot of faces. Maybe it could go a little smaller depending on the detail of the game we were working on, but overall this is a pretty modest resources to produce some, pretty cool effects. One way that you would want to lower the amount of resources you're using is for like this ground here, we've got 4 different layers of color, which are great to be able to go in here and adjust things and tweak stuff and get it looking really good. But when we're ready to export for a game, we would want to first decide how big of a resolution we want the whole merged map to be. Maybe 512, maybe bigger, depending on whatever your purposes were. Then you would want to go to options and new merged layer. And you would want to save before you do this. And you would want to keep a master file where you keep all your individual layers on there so you can go back and tweak them however you want. And then for your game file, you would probably delete those and just keep the merged layer. And then if you need to save those images to where your objects pull on those images from a folder of images and not to an internal blend file, you would want to click this button and click Save to Hard Drive and then select a location. So for instance, on desktop, we could just navigate to a folder, or we could create a new directory or a new folder. That's what that means, create a new directory. So we're on the desktop, so this will create a new folder on the desktop. We could just call it object images or whatever, it doesn't matter. Click on it, click accept, and then we'd click save my layers. And here in this folder, we have all of the layers going to that object. Now you can go through each object and set an individual folder, or you can, before you get started on your project, just set a location, and every new object you make, so long as you keep save to hard drive on, will continue to save to that location when you click save my layers. And then of course also, if your image does not depend on transparency, then you don't need a type PNG or type TIFF. You would probably want to save it as JPEG because it's a much smaller file size, or typically a smaller file size. So when you're exporting for that, it would be good to do that. So that's pretty much it. Hope you've enjoyed this quick little tutorial. Made a very simple scene here, but we covered a lot of very powerful features to create some, if you spent time on it, very nice environments. So thanks for watching.